Hey everybody, here we are talking about climate once again. You probably saw that in the frame as it just jumped up ahead of time. Is it of a natural origin? This has been my question, not since the beginning of it, because I was kind of hook, line, and sinker. I bought into the story and I accepted it. It all kind of made sense. And there's the whole theory that if you hear something over and over and over and over again, you make it big enough, you make it simple enough, and you keep repeating it, and you hear this story from enough people that you'll then buy the story. That's just part of what is propaganda. The question is then, why would a disinformation campaign, why would a propaganda, why would something so big and so grand be thrown out there? And that was a whole nother a self discovery of trying to figure that one out. And I'm sure I'm not alone. I know I'm not alone, as there are many others in the field of meteorology and climatology, natural sciences. Solar physics. The list is long of those scientists, or even just amateurs, and that's what we all are at heart. You know, kind of the excitement of being amateurs in this field, and in other fields that we have hobby interests in, whether it's economics, whether it's outdoor sports, whether it's rock climbing, whether it's skiing, weather and climate impacts so many of those events, and so to ignore or not even be aware that there might be a climate issue upon us would be kind of hard to imagine, especially with as much press as it has gotten, and especially a little Greta Thunberg has been, kind of like front and center. She's been the poster child for this, and interesting if you dig in to see who her parents and what her backstory are. That is a very fascinating story to see how that aspect of this has been leveraged. Good evening, Jane, Robin, Vicky, and then those others that are joining. So let's come on in here. I have a lot more than I can probably digest, and probably a lot more than I should. And as I was flipping through this slideshow, I bailed on so many things because there just isn't time to develop the topics in a way that I feel does it justice, or thread it in a complete way, because we're dealing with we're dealing with governments, we're dealing with astronomy, we're dealing with clouds, we're dealing with location on the planet, we're dealing with the ocean and the atmosphere interface. We're dealing with transparency of the atmosphere, whether we're dealing with additional cloud cover, pollutions. We are dealing with sediment and soot collecting on the poles and changing the albedo, or the whiteness, the reflectivity of a said substance, to either absorb the long wave radiation from the sun and absorb that heat and then melt below, or if it's clean and pure, then very little of that happens until the sun angle gets higher. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, and it's trying to ferret out that which is natural from that which is unnatural. And that is the big thing. And since baselines don't exist, they don't exist because this is the first time this kind of science has been through this process. So we don't have comparisons outside of tree rings, outside of gases trapped in snow in Greenland, Antarctica, and some other glaciers around the area. Centuries old written records, stories of when a river in Germany drops below this mark, that pain shall visit the land, oral traditions. So we're going back 300 plus years where science was just breaking itself free from the grips of religion, which had its own agenda. It had its own ideas. It had its own power struggle with ideology versus truth. And so those kind of things were all in process, and we're just kind of waking up to maybe we have something at hand. And certainly, is the climate crisis of natural origin? What are the options resulting from the genesis of this climate crisis? As the scientists proclaim, the burning of carbon fuels. This is the one. This is the AWG, anthropogenic global warming. That's it. And then also, the past is telling us stories of solar and orbital cycles. And then there's a political aspect to this, of a UN agenda of a certain character by the name of Maurice Strong, and his works within environmentalism and what we can do and should do on a global scale to save the planet. And then maybe it's something not yet seen, something unknown, something recognized, something not discussed. Perhaps that's a geoengineering. So in settled science, when 97% of the scientists agree, we can't even come up for a tagline. It's global cooling, 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Then all of a sudden it's global warming that morphed and became on the landscape, on the media landscape in the scientific literature at some point in the 80s. And then as we kind of plateaued temperature-wise in the late 90s, that had to be called a climate change. But then climate has always changed, so maybe we'll just call it climate disruption. And then, of course, every big event, one way or another, is just called weather. So we kind of started with the big freeze. We're going to go back to 74, and scientists have found other indications of global cooling, the so-called circumpolar vortex. And there was a lot of literature published in the 50s and 60s about what we could do to open the Arctic Ocean for commerce, for exploration, for the economy of the planet. That was an agenda. How can we open that for oil exploration, for mineral extraction? What could we do to affect that change? And so that work was underway, and most of the science was, okay, we're kind of warm right now, and we can get up there and we can do some work. But ultimately, all of the longer range cycles are telling us the planet is going to cool. So just last winter, February 3 of 19, our frigid polar vortex blasts are now connected to global warming. So they're even trying to spin this to where those stories or those experiences of extreme cold are now, of course, tied to the agenda. So let's throw some context into this discussion. If we go back 2,000 years ago, kind of cool at about 0 AD-ish, and a couple of warm spells right towards 1 to 300 AD during the last years of Rome. And then we had a late 6, 7, 800 AD period of warm period. Actually, it wouldn't even be that. That would be this medieval warm period, which was long lasting. And this is when the Vikings got to Greenland and they got to Newfoundland. They were able to traverse the Atlantic and set up settlements up there because it was so lush and productive enough in Greenland that we could bring goats and cattle and harvest grains and so forth, and begin to build a sustenance society with agriculture and livestock. And it worked until we turned blue, until the planet began to cool off at about 1250 AD. And then it got really cold in the 1600s. And now we've just begun we have come out of this interglacial period. So we had a little 600-700 years that were rather chilly, and we've just enjoyed the warm side of that. So from what we talked about Monday, CO2 has been the boogeyman. That has been the issue, Risa. That's what they're telling us, is that it's CO2, that this invisible gas gets into the atmosphere by humans burning hydrocarbons, lots and lots and lots of hydrocarbons. You can't pay enough. We got to quit using hydrocarbons. This then establishes a layer of reflection that bounces back heat to the Earth's surface. This story is presented to us as being the greenhouse effect. Greenhouses work for two things. You've got a layer, a greenhouse, that is almost impermeable. You let the sunlight in, but there is a glass or a plastic or a plexiglass. There is some kind of barrier to then trap the heat. CO2 cannot do that. It simply cannot do that. We've got too much wind, too much mixing in the atmosphere, and then straight up, there isn't enough CO2 to do, to create that kind of a barrier. So it has to be and work in cooperation with many other elements and many other gases. But there just aren't enough of them. So nitrogen is largely what we're breathing right now, 78% nitrogen, and it's the 21% oxygen that our bodies use in oxidization. And then man-made CO2 right down here is this little single dot, 1/10,000th of the atmosphere. Well, actually, it's 1.25 of 1/10,000th. And then a natural made CO2 is the other 3 parts of the 4 parts of the equation. So it's very, very little. In Colorado, there's a lot of greenhouses. I'll let you imagine why. But increasing the CO2 levels in these environments is essential for good results. Additionally, there are benefits to raising the CO2 levels higher than the global average, up to even 1,500 ppm or greater. Outdoors, the Mauna Loa reading is just a little under 420 ppm. So we're looking at nearly 4 times that level in these greenhouses. And commercial greenhouses growing hydroponic tomatoes with CO2-enriched air, and their yields are up by 1/3. So part of why the CO2 level is going down or is going up is simply because the plants are not processing it. We're cutting down forests. We're cutting down, I don't want to necessarily say the lungs of the planet, but we are cutting down trees that would process and continue, especially in places like Brazil or these tropical locations. It is those locations that process most of the CO2. And even recently, well, I guess not terribly recently, but back in 71, early on, before the powers that be needed to find a boogeyman, they were actually anticipating that CO2 would impact the planet in a cooling way. These aerosols, the net effect density is to reduce the surface temperature of the Earth because the exponential dependence on backscattering, the rate of temperature decrease would be augmented with increasing aerosol content. An increase by a factor of only 4, the global aerosol background concentration may be sufficient to reduce the surface temperature by as much as 3.5 degrees Kelvin, which is the better part of 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're freaking out over 2 degrees warming. So where we come to is the 1970s, early 70s at that. Pollution was crazy. The EPA had just been deemed necessary and been given some powers to deal with pollution. And pollution was bad. Littering was bad. Industry was really tearing the environment up. And it was needed. It was absolutely needed. So the Club of Rome called for eliminating 150 million Americans, and a frank interview basically saying that it was necessary the United States cut its population by about 2/3 within the next 50 years. And we're there. We're at that 50-year mark. Whoa, come back here, boy. Don't be running away from me too much. I based his conclusion on a study which showed that solar energy and biomass, which in his views were the only viable long-term energy supplies for America, are far less efficient than, say, coal and oil, and therefore can support fewer people. However, once the population is cut by about 150 million, the remaining 75 million could be steadily employed in subsistence agriculture, and unemployed would be virtually nil, as many jobs that are now done by machines would have to then be done by human labor. An interesting vision of the future for America. And then as this moved on, and there's a guy that we're going to see next that was a big part of this 1972 Club of Rome report, and the published paper was The Limits to Growth. And I agree that there are limits. There are limits to how we can live. There are limits to where morally we can impact the environment of others. That, I believe, is a given. And that should be absolutely something that we all should consider in how we go through our day-to-day lives, is that our impact be kind of small, and it's just being considerate of those of others. It's like the loud car going down the road that thinks it's just that cool, but it's so loud that it impacts everybody around them, and it's just this annoyance that that person, that entity, needs to have our attention, and it's very, in my eyes, egocentric. Anyway, back in 72, the first major report, Limits to Growth, were published. It sold millions of copies worldwide, including or creating a media controversy that was also the impetus for the global sustainability movement. This called for an objective scientific assessment of the impact of humanity's behavior and use of resources, and that still defines the Club of Rome today, as it should. While Limits may have many messages, it fundamentally confronted the unchallenged paradigm of continuous material growth and the pursuit of endless economic expansion. 50 years later, there's no doubt the ecological footprint of humanity substantially exceeds its natural limits every year, and they've not lost their relevance. And we've kind of been shown that with the need to grow, the central banks, their paradigm, the model upon which fiat money is based needs to grow. That's all there is to it. If it doesn't grow, then the debt that it's all based on collapses. So Ding Dong, the godfather of global warming, is dead. Paris climate COP21, one of the most dangerous men, according to this paper, had just died. And the weird thing is, hardly anyone noticed. Name was Maurice Strong, Canadian billionaire diplomat and UN apparatchik. In fact, this is how he kind of got his beginning in 1947, as the UN was beginning. And he'd been running in those circles ever since. But nevertheless, it was about Agenda 21 and how we cooperate to undo the economic system the way it's been. And we all agree that there are things to do to bring that to happen. It needs to happen. But is this the solution? Is this the solution, going green energy? And then the question is, what is the end? Are we warming or are we cooling? Green energy would be fine. Well, maybe, if the planet were to continue to warm. And so you don't see the problems of long, dark, cold nights with little wind and then turbines and solar panels. They just leave that, you've got to have something else. You've got to have something geothermal. You've got to have something else. So we're dealing with a large contingent that this group has funded papers and an agenda. And so these guys, the climate guys, end up going to and only can do their work with funding from the big guys, from the governments, from the NGOs. That's where the money is. And so, how do you get to that end? How do you create that potential agenda? Is it possible that the military can then use the weather to their own ends? And is there any difference from, say, the UN and that global agenda from individual sovereign states and their own potential warfare programs? Now, it's been my opinion that we have already an agenda in the skies to create cloud cover and then play with the weather. And can we create such events to which we can then attribute to climate change to then move the ball closer to the goalposts? Is that a possibility? Do we have the technology from space or ground based to resonate the water molecule? I know we're trying to get there with 5G. That's going to put it on the ground, literally on the ground. We will have that technology to profoundly resonate the water molecule. And I can see that already happening with clouds in the sky, to where what would have been rain turns into an amorphous deck of clouds, thereby creating a drought. Or if the opposite polarity is used, we begin to draw it together and then create rain like we may be seeing in China. So because of the enormous expense of any type of weather modification or manipulation that would result, by de facto, this would be an overt form of climate manipulation. Because if this option, per my sources, has been in operation since the 60s, typically our records of climate, as we're comparing what today is happening today to normal, is only your trailing 30 years. So from my vantage point, the entire past 30 years of climate data has already been manipulated. It's already been contaminated by this work. So are we really going up or down temperature-wise if this manipulation is active and underway? So I just kind of wonder what secret technology has been kept from us that could have been used for our benefit for all of these years, and then just how many wars are contrived with no real enemy. All right, now natural cycles and their long understood consequences, because earlier scientists that didn't have access to government dollars, that didn't have access to an agenda. There was an agenda, but it was more like the Earth's at the center of the planet or of the universe. The Earth is flat. But if you go into geologists, they weren't kind of constrained to those kind of things. But science, weather, climate, it's all revolved around this entity, the sun. The sun, that which rises day and night, which varies as we've learned over the years, and it's eccentricity. Either the orbit is highly elliptical, like Mercury's, or nearly circular, like Earth's and Venus's. And then there's the tilt of the planet. Right now, we're moving through August, which means that at the latitude, say 40 latitude north, you will lose 45 minutes of daylight on sunset just in the next, or in these 30 days. We're in the middle of the month now. From 1 August to 31 August, we'll lose 45 minutes. And that's the axial tilt. As we begin to tilt away in the northern hemisphere, away from the sun, and that heads south. By that same token, that much sunlight is gained in the morning in the southern hemisphere at those latitudes at 40 south. And then there's the precession, which is a much longer 26,000 year cycle. So we've got all of these cycles that roll across each other. And this is something climatologists, astronomers have known for a good period of time. So where we were in the 70s, rolling back there, climatologists were pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for climate change or even to allay its effects. They concede that some of the more spectacular solutions proposed, such as melting the Arctic cap by covering it with black soot or diverting Arctic rivers, might create problems far greater than they solve. But scientists see few signs that government leaders anywhere are prepared to take the kind of simple measures of stockpiling food or introducing variables into climate uncertainty into economic predictions of food supplies. That's one of the things that I don't know that even happened today. You've got to go to, say, the Rand Corporation or the military, where they tend to do that a little more comprehensive planning than, say, the government folks. You mean just the quarter by quarter by quarter government people. All right, so where we are is recognize that these larger cycles there's another one in here, and this is the 22-year solar cycle. And then there's even different layers of the sun. There are 3 magnetic layers, different dynamos inside the sun, that when they're in alignment, the sun is very quiet, very still. Its output kind of tones down. And then when they're out of alignment, there's far more chaos, there's far more magnetic storms, and therefore it's energy and radiation across a much broader spectrum coming off the sun. And so this is what we've been recognized. Since 1990, the sun has been in a declining phase of quasi-bicentennial variation in total solar iridescence, TSIs. The decrease in the portion of TSI absorbed by the Earth since 1990 has remained uncompensated by Earth's long-wave radiation into space, meaning that we're starting to lose the thermal inertia. That inertia has been held in the oceans. So as a result, Earth has and will continue to have negative average annual energy balance, and the long-term adverse thermal condition, this quasi-centennial epoch of the new little ice age, started at the end of 2015, and after the maximum phase of solar, at the maximum phase, we just came through a solar cycle 24 that maxed in 15. We're 6 years after that, and now we're towards the bottom. The start of the next solar grand minimum, anticipated solar cycle 27 plus or minus 1 in 2043, and then the new little phase of deep cooling through the new little ice age at 2060 plus or minus 11. The gradual weakening of the Gulf Stream leads to stronger cooling in the zone of action in Western Europe and the eastern parts of the US and Canada. So this is kind of where we are. And with that, with a very strong jet stream, we end up with a strong jet stream. When it gets weak, we tend to have a little wavier action. Actually, if we're cooler here, then the cold wants to come south. If it's weak up to the north, then that doesn't tend to happen so much. We end up with a more zonal jet stream flow. So if we look at the longer terms, guys, the ice core data the last 10,000 years, every peak, drop down, cooler, peak. Every peak has been cooler and lower than the previous one. And that all goes back to the sun. We go back 9,300 years, the trend is downward. We may spike through it, but then the trend is for a sharp reversal. This is where we have been on this time, with about 240 years of a warm-up from the last little ice age, kind of an abrupt warm-up, but that's the inevitable result, is after these peaks, we tend to drop. So the data they're presenting, you, me, us, is it adjusted or unadjusted? And it makes a difference what it'll be. We look at NASA, this particular one, the GISS temperature stations this is recent, this is just 4 years, is just trying to keep a little upward slope where every other data set is down. Every other data set is down. Average January through August maximum temperatures at all 1,200 U.S. historical climatology stations from 1895 and on. We had a little warm up in the 30s, a little cool off in the 60s, and then we saw some wider swings, some back and forths, and that's almost a little bit of climate instability happening with that kind of trend, but ultimately it's kind of down. If we bring it a little more recent to the last 12 years, it's almost flat, but maybe with a little downtrend over the last 6 months. Even if we look at the Southern Hemisphere monthly sea ice extent, just a slight increase, because most of the warming in Antarctica has happened on that little tongue at about 60 west latitude, longitude, out in the Atlantic, where it kind of meets up with Chile and Argentina up in that direction. But the rest of the continent has largely seen cooler than normal temperatures. So how does this relate to us? How does that relate to us? And for me, one of the telltale months is then October. October is when this hemisphere, the northern hemisphere, brings in the harvest. That's when all of the work you've done from March, April, May, June, July, August, September comes to a fruition. You bring it in, you have celebration at the end, there's Thanksgiving, or you don't. And the reason you wouldn't is simply because the weather got in the way. And so this is why October, mid-September to the end of October is so important. Mid-September as you move up into Canada, and then October as we gradually move south through Oklahoma, Arkansas, and deeper into Texas. And this is last year, October, with much of the North American continent in cooler than normal weather. And some of these valleys in the Mountain West and the Western states way below normal temperature. But where was the heat? North of Alaska, in the Arctic, and that's what gets the news. Across the rest of the world, much of Asia last October, much cooler than normal. The jungle regions of Africa, the equatorial regions, cooler than normal. Northern Argentina, Their growing areas cooler than normal. And then again, stateside and even Greenland, very, very cool. As we look through almost the whole year, the Arctic was warm, but then the mid latitudes, those growing regions, were on, cooler than normal, especially stateside in the Americas. They were just cooler than normal, and these are major regions for winter wheat. Kansas on up into the Dakotas, into the Columbia River Basin in eastern Washington State, and then mostly into Canada. But they tend to grow other things. So where we ended up last year was that Canadian farmers had been trying to harvest wheat since August 25th, 3 days. And this was a screenshot I took about 19 September, where 3 days was all they'd been able to do, with thousands of acres now buried in snow in Saskatchewan. And much of this was just lost because of the moisture content into the kernels of wheat, and then the laid down wheat stalks, and they just couldn't get the grains in there to get up. So they had great yields all the way through the year. And then despite the strong yields, the crop's late development was susceptible to late harvest weather, which ultimately was marked by a difficult harvest conditions, including extended cool and rainy snowy conditions across much of the prairies. So it could all be good and jolly, and then if you can't get it out of the field in those 2-3 weeks, it's all for naught. So we see an increase in disasters, and then kind of down. So it's like the chaos of the climate is, we've come through the max, we've gone through the warming, which is the energy for hurricanes, it's the energy for thunderstorms, and now we're beginning to ease it back, where there's less power, more of it's just going to be rain, maybe more, but weaker hurricanes, just more of them. And they're trying to pull the heat out of the oceans. That's what those kind of events do, with massive upwellings underneath. And then this is what's happened. When I was in Puerto Rico last year, beautiful jungles, but it's just everything is cut apart with humans. So the ecosystem has just been divisive. Let's not get into oil. Just divided up all of these ecospheres with zones of inhabitability in places where the natural wildlife and the flora and fauna is just uninhabitable, because we then take our Roundup and our herbicides and our pesticides and we just go kill it. All right, so our solutions are likely to be localized farming and agriculture, where there's the big guys are going to do all they can because A, that's their living, and B, they know we're counting on them. But we're going to have to convert our own yards and our own fences. We've got to do it ourselves. There's some places that you can and you can't, and it's about having friends and neighbors and certified or community sustained agriculture. That's going to be such a big part of it. And part of this, again, is going to be back to cycles where hard times create strong men, and strong men create great good times, and good times create weak men. And who wouldn't say we've gone through a period of pretty good times? We've had easy credit, easy money, high employment, and then weak men create hard times. And that's about where we're going to be. We're going to get into that end where we can see that we haven't planted the orchard, and we're going to need fruit off a tree that should have been planted some years ago. So the man who asks a question is a fool for a minute, and then the man who doesn't ask a question is a fool for life. So we kind of need to be where we've got to ask, are you ready? Are you ready to deal with climate disruptions of things? Not so much warming, but I think it's going to be those September, October freezes. We had a deep, deep freeze May in the Mountain West, and that really hurt the fruit crops. It took down the productivity by 20%. So then the question that the protesters are doing is winter coming, or is winter not coming? And maybe that is the Shakespearean question, is winter may or may not be coming. So war is the glue that holds the empire together. A politician get away with opposing some aspects of the status quo when it comes to healthcare and education, but war is a strategy for maintaining global dominance. And that policy is strictly off limits. And we've set ourselves up for a war on climate, a war on drugs, a war on poverty. We're fighting wars everywhere we go, but it's the only empire. It's the empire that's fighting the wars. And we're the subjects. We're the ones that the empire is fighting against. So this is how you tell the difference between someone who actually wants to change things and someone who's just going through the motions for show. The real rebels forcefully oppose the actual pillars of empire by calling for an end to military bloodshed, while the performers just stick to the safe subjects. Election time, anyone? What are the safe subjects? Or are we even having a discussion at all? Have we even really had a broaching these topics, or even deciding whether we're going to have debates at all? I mean, we should have been having debates every single Saturday night, televised. They should have started in June. Every single night, these topics should have been discussed. Those two characters should have been on the TV talking about things. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. And if they can't, then they shouldn't be presidents. The shrill, hysterical pushback that Tulsi Gabbard, this is about Tulsi Gabbard, received last night was very encouraging, because it means she's forcing them to fight back. In a media environment where war propaganda machine normally coasts along almost entirely unhindered in mainstream attention, the fact that someone has positioned themselves to move the needle like this is a good thing for the future. Good things for the future. If our society is to have any chance of ever throwing off the omnicidal, ecocidal power establishment which keeps us in a state of endless war and soul-crushing opposition, the first step is punching a hole into the narrative matrix, which keeps us hypnotized into believing that this is all normal and acceptable. Whoever controls the narrative controls the world, and whoever disrupts the narrative control is doing the real work. So there are topics that we can talk about and topics that we can't talk about. And those who are censored are likely speaking the truth. If they've just had their Twitter feed yanked or bumped off of Facebook, or had their YouTube channel ripped away, we need to find their materials. What are they saying that they don't want us to hear? Because almost all of these wars have these fake beginnings and false solutions at the end. And that's what we need to be able to see through before Election Day. All right, guys, thanks. We're all debating on a mask and going back to school. I don't think the deeper topics are within the scope of their personal resources. I don't either. Neither of them, frankly, have been qualified to be president. It's crazy. It's clowns. We've all got clowns all around the planet. They put clowns in front of us, and we've accepted it for generations. We haven't had real options, real debates. It's been Kennedy stateside, and other nations have had their own last good folk out there. But it's been probably 3 generations since the States has had a president free of the matrix that controls the narrative. All right, guys, clowns is right. See, right, Risa, it's crazy. It's crazy out there. But I'm not willing to be quiet. I had to say what I had to say, and I think we all should be able to say what we need to say. I guess we just can't say it too loudly. All right, guys, I'll see you on, I guess, tomorrow evening for another look at some weather. See what's happening in the fires in the West, because they are crazy out of control right now. And there's not a lot of additional resources to go work on those. So it's going to have to be Mother Nature. We need some cooler weather and some humidity, and hopefully some rain. Some rain would be nice. All right, catch you tomorrow. Have a great evening, everybody, and keep looking up.